Let us also make the alliance between the local government units and the armed forces of the Philippines a major campaign plank, especially in the local elections. I ask administration candidates to take this up as a key governance thrust and openly support those who pledge to push peace and development and oppose collaborators of those who seek to use violence to overthrow government and to impose their obsolete ideology on the people. In 2010, let us have none of our LGUs flirting with the enemies of the state.
That was President Arroyo addressing the merger of Lakas and Campi on May 28th this year. Now we interrupt our regular series on the presidency because of martial law. Now over the weekend, after the country and the world was losing patience over the seeming Mexican standoff between the Ampatuans and government forces in Maguindanao, the union of local governments and the armed forces was spectacularly demonstrated when the president imposed martial law on the province. Now, the weekend was spent by the president basking in an unfamiliar popularity, while legal experts and politicians wondered what the basis for martial law was and whether it's legal. Tomorrow, Congress meets in joint session to tackle the report the president submitted last night. So what is martial law and what are the issues confronting Congress? Tonight, a crash course on these questions. I'm Manolo Quezon, the explainer. On Saturday morning, the country was told that President Arroyo had imposed martial law on most of Maguindanao the night before, that is, on Friday at 9 p.m. Martial law, the president and her people claimed, was necessary not because something extraordinary had to be done to bring the perpetrators of the Ampatuan massacre to justice, but because the Ampatuans, shown here with their former friend, the president, had ceased delivering government services in Maguindanao. Martial law had last been imposed nationwide on September 23, 1972, backdated to September 21 for good luck. Now, as I said on this station last Saturday, by proclaiming martial law, the president broke the last post-EDSA political taboo, or, as Attorney Teddy Te exclaimed in exasperation, "What part of never again don't you understand?" Now, you don't have to refer just to the Marcos years to discover our national discomfort with martial law. Go back to our revolution against Spain and the symbols that have enshrined our struggle for independence since then to see how martial law is something Filipinos aren't fond of. The sun in our flag has 8 rays, commemorating the provinces of Manila, Cavite, Bulacan, Pampanga, Nueva Ecija, Tarlac, Laguna, and Batangas, which declared independence from Spain in 1896 and were promptly placed under martial law. So what is martial law? The handy-dandy dictionary definition is a simple one: military government involving the suspension of ordinary law. Now, last July, Father Joaquin Bernas, one of the drafters of our present Constitution, explained martial law as a situation in which, quote, police power is exercised by the executive with the aid of the military and in place of certain governmental agencies which, for the time being, are unable to cope with existing conditions in a locality, end quote. Now, martial law is a power the President can wield in her capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and in the past, it included taking on functions normally reserved to the legislature and the courts. Now, during the Japanese occupation, President Laurel, by means of Proclamation 29, declared martial law on September 21, 1944. He divided the country into 9 military districts with military governors, but retained the functioning of the courts. Within a few months, according to Claro M. Recto, any remaining authority the Laurel Republic had vanished when the Makapili essentially took over the government. President Marcos declared martial law on September 23, 1972, and as we know, backdating it to September 21 for luck, and going further than any chief executive before or since. He placed the entire country under martial law, issued an order depriving the Supreme Court of the power to review any of his actions, and decreed that he would, henceforth, assume lawmaking powers, and then he set up military courts not bound by civilian rules of due process. His martial law formally lasted until Pope John Paul II's first visit to the Philippines in 1991, but then he also amended the 1973 Constitution to retain all his martial law powers. Now, in the past, a proclamation of martial law also automatically included the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Now, presidents could always suspend the writ without martial law, and indeed, suspending the writ was considered the penultimate or next to the last step before martial law. Now, the writ of habeas corpus basically means people can go to court to demand the production of a body, that of someone who's been arrested, and for that person to be released unless the government can prove legally it has a basis for detaining that person. Now, President Quirino, by means of Proclamation 210 on October 22, 1950, suspended the writ for several months for those committing the crimes of sedition, insurrection, or rebellion. This was upon the advice of his Secretary of National Defense, Ramon Magsaysay, in order to break the back of the Huk Rebellion. On August 21, 1971, after the Plaza Miranda bombing of the Liberal Party senatorial candidates, President Marcos issued Proclamation 889, suspending the writ, a suspension that lasted until January 7, 1972. Notice that over a year passed before Marcos went from suspending the writ to proclaiming martial law. As it turned out, having restored it, the writ was automatically suspended when Marcos imposed martial law, and what he proceeded to do to ensure he wouldn't be challenged affected the current provisions of our Constitution on martial law and habeas corpus. Two institutions could have challenged him at the time: Congress and the Supreme Court. He intimidated the Supreme Court by threatening to declare a revolutionary government, leaving the justices out of a job. And then, so they meekly passed decisions agreeing with his martial law proclamation and the powers he assumed. They ruled his 1973 Constitution was validly approved, and on that basis, Marcos then attended to the next problem by padlocking Congress. All these things, on the basis of Marcos proposing a full-blown communist rebellion was taking place and that he needed extraordinary measures to crush it, is what justified it. Now, at this point, let me quickly define what rebellion is. Under Article 143 of the Revised Penal Code, which dates back to 1930, it's, quote, rising publicly and taking arms against the government for the purpose of removing from the allegiance to said government or its laws the territory of the Philippine Islands or any part thereof, of any body of land, naval, or other armed forces, depriving the chief executive or the legislature, wholly or partially, of any of their powers or prerogatives, end quote. After Marcos, we adopted a new constitution that tried to make a new dictatorship being established impossible. If Marcos used every avenue to push the constitutional envelope, Cory Aquino tried to exercise the utmost self-control concerning the presidency's powers. She harked back to an earlier era. Neither Presidents Quezon nor Osmeño, for example, ever declared martial law, even in the face of the Japanese invasion. Instead, they exercised emergency powers that had been passed by the National Assembly. Cory Aquino took a similar approach in the face of coup attempts, particularly in 1989. She asked Congress for emergency powers and didn't impose martial law. Fast forward to 2006 when President Arroyo issued Proclamation 1017 on the 20th anniversary of the EDSA Revolution to quell what she believed was a coup attempt against her. The text of the proclamation was substantially copied from Marcos's Proclamation 1081, and some cabinet members proposed she was authorized to exercise powers similar to those Marcos assumed in 1972. Other cabinet members disagreed. In the end, the powers exercised were quite limited, and the state of emergency was lifted on March 3rd with Proclamation 1021. She never went to Congress to ask for emergency powers either. Now, another state of emergency would come when the gentleman on the right, Andalampatuan Sr., shown here with fellow warlord Chavit Singson, got into trouble with their party mate, the president. Now, the Ampatuans had become the supreme warlords in Muslim Mindanao, but others wanted a bigger slice of the pie. Defense Secretary Gilbert Teodoro Jr. tried to negotiate peace between party mates and former allies, the mga Dadatu clan and the Ampatuan clan, but neither would budge. So as we all know, the result was that when the mga Dadatus persisted in challenging the Ampatuans, the Ampatuan massacre took place. The President designated her Secretary of the Interior, Ronaldo Puno, to exercise her powers over the ARMM. We know from the diary of Jesus Doresa that in the meantime, Teodoro's replacement, Norberto Gonzales, had been busy holding